The DNA is telling us. Doing the Y chromosome work, I found that there wasn't a link between Richard III and the male line relatives who are alive today.
Now, you're walking through a parking lot in the middle of England, maybe heading to grab some groceries or meet a friend for coffee. You step over the same patch of asphalt that thousands of other people walk over every single day. But what you don't know is that right beneath your feet, just a few feet under that ordinary concrete, lies one of the most famous and hated kings in all of English history. A king who disappeared for over 500 years. A king whose story is so dark and twisted that Shakespeare turned him into one of literature's most evil villains. This isn't just another history lesson. This is the incredible true story of how modern science solved a mystery that had puzzled historians for centuries. And when DNA testing finally revealed the truth about King Richard III, it didn't just answer old questions. It opened up new ones that are even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into a tale that has everything: royal murder, family betrayal, mysterious disappearances, and scientific detective work that reads like something straight out of a crime thriller. By the time we're done, you'll understand why this discovery shook the entire world, and why some people wish the truth had stayed buried forever. Let me start by painting you a picture of medieval England in the year 1483. Imagine a world without phones, without cars, without any of the technology we take for granted today. This was a time when kings ruled with absolute power, when brothers could kill brothers for a crown, and when children could disappear in the night, never to be seen again. This was the world of Richard III, and it was about to become one of the bloodiest chapters in English royal history. Richard wasn't supposed to be king. He was the younger brother of King Edward IV, which meant he was pretty far down the line of succession. But in medieval times, being close to the throne was just as dangerous as it was powerful. Richard grew up watching his family tear itself apart in what history calls the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between two branches of the royal family. Think of it like a deadly Game of Thrones, except this was real life, and the stakes were life and death. When Richard was just a young man, he watched his father get killed in battle. He saw his older brother claim the throne and rule England for over 20 years. Richard served loyally as his brother's right-hand man, leading armies, governing territories, and doing all the dirty work that came with keeping a kingdom together in those violent times. By all accounts, he was actually pretty good at it. The people in the northern parts of England loved him because he treated them fairly and protected them from Scottish raids. But then everything changed in 1483 when King Edward IV suddenly died. He was only in his early 40s, and his death was completely unexpected. This left behind two young sons, 12-year-old Edward and 9-year-old Richard, who were next in line for the throne. The older boy, Edward, was supposed to become King Edward V. But here's where the story takes a dark turn that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life and beyond. As the boys' uncle, Richard was appointed to be their protector until young Edward was old enough to rule on his own. This should have been a straightforward arrangement. Richard would guide his nephew, teach him how to be king, and then step aside when the boy came of age. Instead, Richard made a decision that would make him one of the most hated figures in English history. Just 2 months after his brother's death, Richard declared that his nephews were illegitimate. He claimed that their father's marriage to their mother had been invalid, which meant the boys had no legal right to the throne. It was a shocking accusation that turned the royal family upside down. According to Richard, since the boys weren't legitimate heirs, the crown should pass to him as the next rightful king. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds pretty convenient for Richard, and you'd be absolutely right. Most historians believe that Richard made up this story about his nephews being illegitimate because he wanted the crown for himself. Whether that's true or not, the result was the same. Richard had himself crowned King Richard III in July 1483, and the two young princes disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen again. The Tower of London wasn't just a fortress, it was also used as a royal residence, and most famously, as a prison. When Richard sent his nephews there, he claimed it was for their own protection, while the question of their legitimacy was sorted out. But weeks turned into months, and the boys were never seen in public again. Rumors began to spread like wildfire throughout London and beyond. people whispered in markets and taverns about what might have happened to the young princes. Had they been murdered? Had they escaped? Were they being held prisoner in some secret location? The mystery of the princes in the tower, as they came to be known, became one of the most enduring unsolved crimes in history. Some people believed that Richard had ordered their deaths to secure his own position on the throne. Others argued that the boys might have died of natural causes, or that someone else entirely was responsible for their disappearance. The truth seemed lost to history. But Richard's troubles were just beginning. His reign was plagued by rebellions and challenges to his authority. Many English nobles never accepted his claim to the throne, and they began to rally around a young man named Henry Tudor, who had his own claim to royal blood. Henry had been living in exile in France, but he saw an opportunity in the chaos surrounding Richard's controversial coronation. The tension between Richard and Henry Tudor came to a head on August 22, 1485, at a place called Bosworth Field. This wasn't just another medieval battle, it was a fight that would determine the future of England. On one side stood Richard, defending his crown with everything he had. On the other side was Henry Tudor, backed by nobles who saw him as England's salvation from what they viewed as Richard's tyrannical rule. The battle itself was brutal and chaotic, as medieval battles always were. Men fought with swords, axes, and longbows in hand-to-hand combat that would be unthinkable by today's standards. Richard, despite everything else you might say about him, was no coward. When he saw Henry Tudor's banner on the battlefield, he made a desperate charge straight toward his rival, determined to end the fight in single combat. It was a bold move, but it was also Richard's last mistake. As he fought his way toward Henry, Richard became separated from his own bodyguards. Enemy soldiers surrounded him, and in the chaos of battle, the last Plantagenet king was cut down and killed. Some accounts say he was struck down by multiple weapons. Others suggest he was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. What everyone agreed on was that Richard III, the man who had been King of England for just 2 years, died fighting on that muddy field in Leicestershire. But here's where the story gets even stranger. After Richard died, his body seemed to vanish almost as mysteriously as his nephews had. Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII after his victory, ordered that Richard's body be displayed publicly to prove that his rival was really dead. According to historical records, Richard was then buried at a church called Greyfriars in the city of Leicester. But as the centuries passed, the exact location of that burial site was forgotten. The church where Richard was supposedly buried was demolished during King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Local legends claimed that Richard's remains had been dug up and thrown into a nearby river, but there was no way to know if that was true or just another story that had grown in the telling over hundreds of years. For nearly 5 centuries, the final resting place of King Richard III remained one of history's unsolved mysteries. Meanwhile, Richard's reputation only got worse as time went on. About a century after his death, a playwright named William Shakespeare wrote a play about him that portrayed Richard as a twisted, evil hunchback who murdered his way to the throne. Shakespeare's Richard was a villain of almost cartoonish proportions, a man so consumed by ambition that he killed his own family members without a second thought. The play was incredibly popular and helped cement Richard's image as one of history's great monsters. But Shakespeare was writing entertainment, not history, and he was working for the Tudor dynasty that had defeated Richard. It was definitely in their interest to make Richard look as bad as possible to justify their own claim to the throne. Still, Shakespeare's version of Richard became the one that most people remembered, and it shaped how the world thought about this controversial king for hundreds of years. Fast forward to the early 21st century, and enter a woman named Philippa Langley. Philippa wasn't a professional historian or archaeologist. She was a screenwriter who had become fascinated by the story of Richard III. The more she learned about him, the more she began to suspect that history had been unfair to his memory. She started to believe that Richard might have been the victim of centuries of propaganda spread by his enemies. Philippa joined something called the Richard III Society, a group of people who believed that the traditional view of Richard as a villain was wrong. These weren't just history buffs. They were serious researchers who had spent years studying medieval documents and challenging the accepted narrative about Richard's life and reign. They called themselves Ricardians, and they were determined to clear their hero's name. In 2009, Philippa had what she later described as an almost mystical experience while visiting Leicester. She was walking through a parking lot that had been built over the area where Greyfriars Church once stood, and she felt a strange compulsion to focus on one particular parking space marked with the letter R. She became convinced that King Richard was buried somewhere beneath that very spot. Now, this might sound completely crazy to you, and honestly, it sounded pretty crazy to most people at the time. But Philippa was determined to find out if her hunch was correct. She began working with archaeologists from the University of Leicester, trying to convince them to excavate the parking lot. It took years of planning and fundraising, but finally, in August 2012, they got permission to start digging. The archaeologists approached the project with professional skepticism. They knew that the chances of actually finding Richard's remains were incredibly slim. Medieval burial sites had been disturbed countless times over the centuries. Buildings had been constructed and demolished on the same ground over and over again. Even if Richard had been buried there originally, his bones could have been scattered or destroyed long ago. But on the very first day of excavation, something extraordinary happened. The archaeologists uncovered human remains in almost the exact spot where Philippa had felt that mysterious compulsion 3 years earlier. The skeleton was that of an adult male, and it showed clear signs of battle wounds. Even more intriguingly, the spine showed evidence of severe scoliosis, a curvature that would have made one shoulder higher than the other and created a hunched appearance. This was potentially huge. Historical accounts had described Richard as having some kind of physical deformity, though they varied widely in their details. Shakespeare had portrayed him as a hunchback, though most historians believe this was an exaggeration meant to make Richard seem more villainous. But here was a skeleton that actually did show spinal deformity. Could this really be the remains of England's most controversial king? The archaeologists knew they needed much more evidence before they could make such an extraordinary claim. They carefully excavated the entire skeleton and began a series of tests that would take months to complete. First, they studied the battle wounds. The skull showed clear evidence of trauma that would have been fatal. There were cuts and puncture wounds that matched the kinds of weapons used in medieval combat. Most tellingly, there was evidence of a massive blow to the back of the head that had carved away part of the skull. This was exactly the kind of wound that might be inflicted on someone who had lost their helmet in the chaos of battle. The spine told an even more interesting story. The scoliosis was quite severe, with the curve measuring about 65 to 85 degrees. This would have made the person's right shoulder noticeably higher than the left and would have shortened their overall height. However, contrary to Shakespeare's portrayal, this deformity wouldn't have created a true hunchback appearance, and it wouldn't have prevented someone from being an active warrior. But physical evidence alone wasn't enough to prove the skeleton's identity. The archaeologists needed DNA confirmation, and that's where this story gets really fascinating. The problem was that DNA degrades over time, and after more than 500 years in the ground, there was no guarantee that any usable genetic material would remain. Even if they could extract DNA, they would need something to compare it to, and Richard had no known direct descendants. This is where the science gets really clever. The researchers decided to look for mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line and is more stable than nuclear DNA. They would need to find living descendants of Richard's female relatives to make a comparison. After extensive genealogical research, they identified several people who could trace their maternal lineage back to Anne of York, Richard's sister. One of those descendants was a man named Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker living in London who had no idea he was related to medieval royalty until the researchers contacted him. Michael agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison. Another descendant, Wenzel Sitte, was found living in Germany. Both men could trace their maternal line back to the same source as Richard III. The DNA extraction process was incredibly delicate. The researchers had to work with tiny samples taken from the skeleton's teeth and bones, using advanced techniques to amplify any genetic materials. All they could find. It was painstaking work that required absolute precision, because contamination could ruin the entire investigation. Finally, after months of analysis, the results came back. The mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton was a perfect match for both Michael Ibsen and Wenzel Sitte. The odds that this could be a coincidence were astronomical, something like 6.7 million to 1. Combined with the physical evidence, the location of the find, and the dating of the remains, there was no doubt about it. They had found King Richard III. The announcement of the discovery in February 2013 made headlines around the world. It was one of the most significant archaeological finds in British history. But as exciting as the discovery was, it also raised new questions that were even more disturbing than the old ones. Remember that DNA testing I mentioned? Well, it revealed something that nobody had expected. When the researchers extended their analysis to look at the Y chromosome, which is passed down through the paternal line, they found something shocking. The skeleton's Y chromosome didn't match what they expected from Richard's known paternal lineage. This suggested that somewhere in Richard's family tree, there had been what scientists politely call a false paternity event. In plain English, someone had cheated on their spouse, and a child had been born who wasn't actually the biological offspring of their supposed father. This wasn't necessarily Richard himself. It could have happened in any generation between Richard and his known ancestors. But here's where it gets really disturbing. If there was illegitimacy in Richard's own family line, it could mean that Richard himself had no legitimate claim to the throne. Remember, his entire justification for taking the crown away from his nephews was that they were illegitimate. If Richard himself was illegitimate, then his actions weren't just morally questionable. They were based on complete hypocrisy. The implications go even deeper than that. If Richard's family line had been compromised by illegitimacy, it raises questions about the legitimacy of other English monarchs as well. Royal succession was supposed to be based on bloodline, but DNA testing was revealing that medieval royal families were just as messy and complicated as any other families. The researchers were careful not to jump to conclusions about exactly where, in the family tree, this false paternity might have occurred. It could have happened several generations before Richard was born, or it might have been more recent, but the very fact that it existed at all cast Richard's story in an entirely new light. There were other disturbing discoveries as well. Analysis of Richard's bones revealed that he had been eating a very high-protein diet in the years before his death, suggesting that he had been living extremely well while much of England was struggling with poverty and hunger. Chemical analysis of his teeth showed that he had moved around quite a bit during his childhood, which matched historical records of his early life, but also suggested a level of privilege that was completely unavailable to ordinary people. Perhaps most chilling of all was the evidence of what had happened to Richard's body after he died at Bosworth Field. The skeleton showed clear signs of what archaeologists call humiliation injuries, wounds inflicted after death. There were cuts and stab wounds that had been made way, and Richard was already dead, suggesting that his enemies had mutilated his corpse as a final insult. This matched some historical accounts that described Richard's naked body being slung over a horse and paraded through the streets of Leicester so that everyone could see that the king was really dead. It was a brutal end for anyone, regardless of what they might have done in life. The physical evidence painted a picture of a man who had been hated so intensely that even his dead body wasn't safe from his enemies' anger. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Richard's story is what it tells us about power and family in medieval times. Here was a man who had everything: royal blood, military skill, political intelligence, and he threw it all away for a crown. Whether he murdered his nephews or not, he certainly destroyed their lives and plunged England into chaos for his own ambition. The DNA evidence adds another layer to this tragedy. If Richard really was illegitimate himself, then his entire life was built on a lie. All those years of serving his brother loyally, all that fighting to protect the family honor, all of it might have been meaningless because he wasn't even a true member of the family he was trying to protect. And what about those two young princes who disappeared in the tower? Their fate remains a mystery even today. While we now know what happened to Richard, we still don't know for certain what happened to 12-year-old Edward and 9-year-old Richard. Did their uncle really order their deaths? Did they die of natural causes? Did they somehow escape and live out their lives in secret? The DNA analysis that solved one mystery has left another one still hanging over English history like a dark shadow. The discovery of Richard's remains has also forced historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the late medieval period. If royal families were dealing with questions of legitimacy and false paternity, how many other official histories might be wrong? How many other family secrets are still buried, literally and figuratively, waiting for modern science to dig them up? Today, Richard III rests in Leicester Cathedral, where he was reinterred in 2015 in a ceremony that was both solemn and controversial. Some people argued that he should have been buried at York in northern England, where he had been most popular during his lifetime. Others said that Leicester, where he had been found, was the appropriate place. The debate reflected the fact that even in death, Richard remains a divisive figure. The cathedral where he now lies is a far cry from the unmarked grave where he spent over 500 years beneath a parking lot. His tomb is made of beautiful white stone, carved with his name, dates, and coat of arms. Visitors come from around the world to see the final resting place of England's most controversial king. But even in this peaceful setting, Richard's story continues to raise uncomfortable questions about power, family, and the prices people are willing to pay for a crown. The scientific techniques that identified Richard have opened up incredible possibilities for solving other historical mysteries. DNA analysis is now being used to investigate other famous disappearances and disputed identities from the past. We're living in an age where science can reach back across the centuries and answer questions that have puzzled humanity for generations. But with those answers come new responsibilities. When we learn uncomfortable truths about the past, what do we do with that knowledge? Richard's story shows us that sometimes the truth really is worse than the legends. Sometimes the secrets that families and societies bury are meant to stay buried, but they rarely do. The case of Richard III reminds us that history is never as simple as it seems in textbooks or movies. Real people lived these stories with all their complications, contradictions, and uncomfortable truths. They made choices that seemed reasonable to them at the time, but look monstrous to us today. They carried secrets that they thought would die with them, not knowing that future technology would dig up those secrets along with their bones. In the end, the DNA analysis that finally solved the mystery of King Richard III has given us much more than just the location of a dead king's bones. It's given us a window into the messy, complicated reality of medieval royal life. It's shown us that even kings and queens were just human beings, with all the flaws and failures that come with being human. And it's reminded us that sometimes, when we go looking for answers to old questions, we find new questions that are even more disturbing than what we started with. That's the real lesson of Richard III's story. The truth doesn't always set us free. Sometimes it just gives us new burdens to carry and new mysteries to solve. But that's the price we pay for understanding our past, and it's a price that's always worth paying, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. So the next time you're walking through an ordinary parking lot or driving down a quiet street, remember that history is all around us, waiting to be discovered. Remember that the ground beneath our feet holds countless stories, some inspiring and some terrifying, but all of them part of the great human story that continues to unfold every single day. And remember King Richard III, the man who wanted a crown so badly that he was willing to destroy everything and everyone to get it, only to lose it all in a muddy field after just 2 years of wearing it. His story is a warning from the past about the dangers of unchecked ambition, but it's also a testament to the power of modern science to reach across the centuries and give voice to the dead. If this incredible story of royal mystery, family secrets, and scientific detective work has fascinated you as much as it fascinated me, then I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button to show your support for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. Share this video with anyone you know who loves history, true crime, or just incredible stories that sound too wild to be true, but absolutely are. And make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started with stories like this one. History is full of secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we're going to uncover them together, one DNA sample at a time. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we're digging up next.